Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to continue on with our journey, our discussion, with respect to the works which can be found in the excellent set that was released by the Criterion Collection earlier this year. And that set is called World of Wong Kar Wai, and it has a number of works from the acclaimed filmmaker artist Wong Kar Wai. And among those works is the work which was released in the year 2000. The title is花样年華, or in English, In the Mood for Love. This is the work from the year 2000, and it is from the acclaimed cinematic artist extraordinaire Wong Kar Wai, and it stars, among others, in its impeccable, brilliant cast, Maggie Cheung Manyuk and Tony Leung Chiu Wai. And this is, of course, the work which is, again, please pardon me for my very poor pronunciation,花样年華, or in English, In the Mood for Love. The extraordinary, towering achievement that is the work In the Mood for Love, I think, like all of Wong Kar Wai's works, operates on many different levels and various modes and dimensions of space and time and emotion, and a sense of historical and societal context and perspective and philosophy that is being explored, while at the same time dealing in a very profound and unforgettable way with the human emotional landscape that could be said to be touching upon nerves and feelings and rumors and ideas that are very universal. And so already we have a dense, rich, complex work that is multi-level and multi-landscape and multi-textural, while at the same time being a cohesive whole that is presenting many ideas at once. It is also presenting them in a way that is beautiful, that is filled with life and color, that is also filled with richness and texture, while also signifying or suggesting a sense of many different tones or feelings that could be said to be consistent, or perhaps they could be said to be inconsistent or in conflict with each other. And to put it in a very basic way, the idea of passion and emotion on the one hand versus the idea of restraint and control and perhaps even suppression on the other. And that overall fundamental human emotional type of exploration, that the terrain that is being explored and that objective forms perhaps the backdrop or the backbone around which, or based upon which, this film operates, as I say, in a very profound and significant way. And so that is a very roundabout way, perhaps, to suggest or to say that this film, like with Wong Kar Wai's works, this film operates on so many different levels and dimensions. It is so many things at once, and yet at the same time it is there in the moment. It is a sense of cinematic glory and beauty, manifest in the eye and the color and the music and the sound and the spirit and the movement and the emotion that is conveyed in every single frame, in every corner, in every part of what we are watching, what we are experiencing as we engage with this remarkable work of art. This is In the Mood for Love. if we were to try to focus on the essence of the plot or the story of the film or the characters of the film, I think we could focus in on this period of this part of the world, which is the early 1960s in Hong Kong. And this particular era, or this particular time period, is also very significant, and we'll try to get to that later in this video. But in this context, in this particular social fabric, we meet two different characters, the Maggie Cheung character and the Tony Leung character. And this is the Chow Mo Wan and Su Li Jian, or Mrs. Chan and Mr. Chow. And these are very significant characters, and the way they meet is also very significant. They are in close proximity. There's also almost a sense of coincidence that perhaps brings them together, or maybe it's not coincidence, who knows. But in any event, they are brought in similar proximity, and due to certain circumstances which are revealed as the film progresses, they each realize that their respective spouses may in fact be having an affair with each other, thus creating this very complex, awkward, and quite complicated bond between the Maggie Cheung character, Mrs. Chan, and the Tony Leung character, Mr. Chow. And thus is established this emotional terrain, this landscape, if you will, upon which these characters are presenting themselves to us and vis-a-vis each other. And there is, of course, the interplay of fiction and reality. There is the idea of storytelling and role-playing that is being engaged between the two of them. There is also the idea of their respective worlds, the society in which they live, and also the sense or the themes and notions that command certain expectations that are imposed upon them in their particular roles in society at the time. And what I mean by this is their roles respectively in terms of their work, their occupations, and also their relationships with their particular spouses, their own family units, as it were, and also within the realms of society and the appearances of good manners, and how this is also very much part of how their relationship, the two of them, may or may not be able to develop in this particular society at this particular point in time. And this, of course, paves the way for something very universal and very, I think, accessible to anyone who has experienced or who has felt a type of emotional bond or the yearning for an emotional bond with another human being. And that is the story between these two characters, these extraordinary characters, and this is extraordinary story that is so universal at heart, which is the sense of attraction and passion between them on the one hand, and also their pressures and their feelings that each of them have for their own reasons as to whether or not they will or will not be able to consummate whatever emotional relationship that they might have in between each other, the two of them, the Maggie Cheung character and the Tony Leung character. This is, of course, at the very heart of passion and also restraint. There is also the sense of enigma and mystery, and that mystery is, I think, at the very heart of what it is to experience some kind of existential dilemma. In other words, the idea of how much do we really know and understand the people that we associate with or that are part of our lives. We feel like we have emotional bonds with people, but at the same time, there's a gulf between people that sometimes is insurmountable. And so what is it about other people that we understand, but also what is it about other people that remains a mystery and an enigma, to one and one's own subjective viewpoint? And how is that made even further complicated when you have feelings of passion and attraction and also feelings of yearning that come about for various reasons, but that do come about. And what does that mean in terms of this insurmountable gulf on the one hand, but also the yearning that makes us want to know what the other person is feeling and experiencing on the other. And that, I think, is at the very heart of this polar dynamic between passion and restraint that is set forth in this film. And indeed, there is this idea of fate and destiny, and that fate and destiny might have a positive spin or a negative spin, depending on one's perspective on the so-called love story of the film. In other words, are they able to get together or not? What is their state of affairs emotionally between themselves and thus vis-a-vis each other? And so there is a sense of passion and love in the air, but also there's a sense of mystery and tension as to, as I say, whether or not their relationship, whatever it may be, can progress to some state of, say, emotional fulfillment or satisfaction. But this is, of course, some of the levels that this film is operating on a magnificent and brilliant scale. But it is also operating on so many other levels that make it, I think, a very rich and very deep and profound movie experience. So, for example, we have here the role of history and society and the exploration of the particular, say, environment and social constructs and contexts in which these particular subplots and stories are emerging. So, for example, we have a dealing in this film or by this film of a sense of the past, a sense of some kind of lost time. And we're speaking in terms of the history, which is the early 1960s in Hong Kong. And this is very significant because we have a society that is, as I say, Hong Kong, but is also a depiction, to some degree anyway, of the population that are from Shanghai. And they have come from Shanghai to Hong Kong. And it is this particular setup, this particular building or these particular rooms where we have the Rebecca Pan character, who's also from Shanghai, and we have the Maggie Cheung character, who's also from Shanghai. And so that is part of the reason why perhaps they find themselves together the way they do. And also entering into this particular equation, we have the Tony Leung character. And so, but here we have this idea of people from Shanghai, and also the Cantonese population as well, as represented by the Chow Mo-an character. And so this is, I think, very much important in terms of establishing a sense of the societal connectivity that exists between the various populations that were coexisting in this particular point in time in Hong Kong, again in the 1960s. And also this is very key too, because we have a sense of culture and a sense of language. That language can be the same, it also might be different. And we have this growing sense, this sense of Hong Kong during this time. It is a mixture of various cultures that seem to be coming together, or are they indeed coming together? And perhaps this coming together or not coming together is best exemplified in this literary type of metaphor in the relationship between Mrs. Chen and Mr. Chow, respectively. And so perhaps their coming together might seem to be a type of literary metaphor or parallel, if you will, the intimate and the historical, the micro and the macro, which I think is always at the heart of every film that Wong Kar Wai is making, namely how the intimate story is deeply rooted and tied so significantly with the society level and the historical context level that this film is operating in. And so this film seems to be talking in those terms about the ability or inability of, say, certain groups of people to be able to come together and to understand each other in a very maybe deep emotional way. And whether or not the film answers that question, of course, is up to you to decide as you watch the film. But that is perhaps one way to look at it in terms of linking the intimate with the historical. Along that same basis, of course, we have the idea of the refugee, of the people who are, say, running away from certain situations that are otherwise expected of them or imposed upon them. And we have, therefore, the idea of movement of people from one place to the other, or the escape or the evading from one place and escaping to another. And I think this is shown, again, on the intimate level and also on the macro historical societal context upon which this film is based. So, for example, we have the characters, as I say, of Sulijan, Mrs. Chen character, and, say, Rebecca Pan character and others. We see them coming, or we understand that they have essentially emigrated from Shanghai to Hong Kong in the early 1960s, which is where they find themselves at the start of the film. And then we have the movement from Hong Kong out of Hong Kong as well. So we have, for example, the spouse going to Japan. We have the movement to, say, Singapore, and then we have a movement later to Angkor Wat. And so we have movements from outside to the inside Hong Kong, and then from Hong Kong to other places. And so we have various movements of people. Sometimes they meet, sometimes they don't meet. And I think sometimes they are together, sometimes they drift apart. And that sense of movement, coming together and drifting apart, is also linked both on an intimate level with the story between Maggie Cheung and Tony Leung as they exist between each other, and also it goes the opposite way, because sometimes they move together and sometimes they are seen to be apart, and that is on purpose or that is accidental, and depends on the circumstances of the particular plot along the way. But in any event, this movement towards and away from each other is also, I think, a trend line or a parallel that we see in terms of characters moving from one place to another, or escaping from one place to another, or migrating from one place to another. And if we bring it to the broad historical context, we can understand too that during this time, the 1960s, or the early 1960s in Hong Kong, this is a very significant detail, especially when we recall, or when we are reminded of, the relationship, a very peculiar relationship between Hong Kong and China, the mainland, because we have the end of the 1950s and the what is known as the Great Leap Forward. From the end of the 1950s up to the mid-1960s and the start of the Cultural Revolution. So during this period in the early 1960s, we understand that, the migration border between mainland China and Hong Kong was relaxed or loosened, relatively speaking, which allowed for essentially the migration of people from the mainland to Hong Kong, such as people from Shanghai. And that is represented in the film quite remarkably by, say, Rebecca Pan character and Maggie Cheung character. And that is also reflected in the culture and the food and the language that is at the very heart of the landscape that we see expressed in this film, In the Mood for Love, both in terms of the dress and the decor, but also the feeling and atmosphere. And we see that this movement is also ongoing, because it's also from Hong Kong as well. And this leads to, I think, a remarkable way in which this film seems to transcend both time and space, because we see also movements from this particular moment in time and space elsewhere. So in terms of physically speaking, or in terms of the environmental change, we have movements from here to other parts of the world, as I mentioned, Singapore and Angkor Wat as being examples, and following the the line of movement of, say, the Tony Leung character, Chamoen character, from one place to the other, and then how those lines might intersect or not intersect depending on the particular situation. So movement away from Hong Kong on the one hand, and then also there's this idea of how this is linked or related not just to the moment in time that the film is taking place, again, the early 1960s up to 1966. It's not just here, although it is very significantly part of this period of time. It is also linked to the very present, the time period in which the film was released, the contemporary aspect of Hong Kong and the history of Hong Kong, especially after we know what happens in 1997, what's known as the handover, the change of control of the sovereignty of Hong Kong from British control to the control of China. But we understand also that in this particular point of history, we have the notion of the key point of 50 years. And so the idea from 1997 to the very end there of that 50-year period would be the number or the year, which is 2046. And so what we have in this particular context or discussion of a very current history at the time of the release of this film is the idea of a situational or story that is situated in a particular history that is, I think, or that could be understood by many people who are directly involved or living or part of Hong Kong and Hong Kong society from the late 20th century onwards. And that could be understood by contemporary audiences. And so the idea of moving characters within the 1960s Hong Kong story, moving to and from this particular city, that I think finds its parallels also in the way in which history of the 1990s and the 2000s, how that was affecting people who were living in the area at the time too, moving to and from, etc. So this idea of past and present merging in this brilliant way within the context of what the film is discussing is, again, another genius move, another genius example by which we see Wong Kar Wai and his cinema operating in many time zones at once. It's multi-temporal and it's multi-textural, so it transcends both space and time itself to create something that is wholly operating on many different avenues at once. So it's the 1960s history and also the contemporary 1990s history that is at play here. And we also understand this too because it's not just dealing with past and present, but also has notions of the future, which is, I think, a very direct reference to the number 2046 and what this means as a type of symbol, as a type of end of the journey, end of the road, what happens beyond this particular year, and how this is represented in a sense of mystery and unknown, and perhaps even a journey, and perhaps even a way in which people are escaping to something, and maybe it means many things to many different people. It is a very significant number, especially in considering the contemporary history and politics of Hong Kong vis-a-vis China, and it is also very significant in the world of Wong Kar Wai. In particular, we have this number has a very strong significance in the story structure of In the Mood for Love. And indeed, perhaps in other films as well, we might see how this number is a very significant one indeed. But I think we also must keep in mind its historical context. And I think when we do keep that in mind, we understand, therefore, that its reference, as it's found in this film, ultimately means that this film is dealing with the past, the present, and the future, all at once. And so everything that we see the characters doing in this film seems to have a type of mirror or parallel in the present, and it seems to have an echo or a type of foreshadowing of possibility or angst or the unknown in terms of the future. So past, present, and future, all wrapped into one in this presentation style that Wong Kar Wai is essentially giving us in his trademark style that is both cool, smooth, artistic, retro chic, and also very emotionally involved and deep and profound and personal. And I must say too, I must circle and underline the word personal here too, because this film, as I say, it's operating on so many levels at once. And one of those levels too is we have to recall the autobiographical nature of this film in the context of Wong Kar Wai's life, because, and this I think becomes very clear in some of the supplements that we find in this particular release, namely that Wong Kar Wai and his life and how he came from Shanghai and he moved to Hong Kong when he was just a boy. I think he says around when he was 5 years old. And so for many reasons, it was a new place for him, and he had to learn about the world and the language, because the language is very different. That's a very key aspect in terms of the language that's spoken in Hong Kong and the language that's spoken in, say, Shanghai, and the differences between the two, or difference between many of the different dialects that can be said to be in this particular part of the world. And so this is very much also a part of Wong Kar Wai's life as he has described it in various interviews and the like, and biography and biographical details. And so this is also operating, therefore, on an intimate scale. This is operating on a universal scale in which we're dealing with a story, a love story about passion and restraint that I think can be understood by anyone on the one hand. But then also it is a reflection that is arguably very much charged with the autobiographical nuance of Wong Kar Wai's life. And also it's operating on the social or historical construct that makes the context very key indeed. So it's both universal and based on context at the same time. And so much like all of Wong Kar Wai's work, this is a work that is, as I say, based on so many dimensions, and yet it is so amazing to consider just how well constructed it is, but also how well it all hangs together. There is a focus, there is a type of mystery and haze and atmosphere that is guided along by the look of the film and the dreaminess of the film and the slow motion aspect and the music and the way that it seems to float on the one hand, but it also is suggestive of something very volcanic and very passionate and very much bubbling beneath the surface. Or is it? Again, that's part of the mystery and that's part of the enigma that is attached so profoundly and so poetically to this remarkable work of art, and that it seems to suggest and yet not suggest, and it seems to show and not show. It seems to give us the answers and yet at the same time pose as many questions, much like the secrets of humanity itself, the secrets of one's existence. And what do we do with those secrets? What do we do when we are faced with secrets? And those secrets can be both very intimate and personal. They can be profoundly historical and quite universal indeed. So they can reach towards the heavens, or they can be quite intensely subjectively one's own. And who knows the answer to that? No one except yourself. And what do we do with those secrets? Do we express them, or do we keep them hidden to the very end? And so this is a film that I think is giving us, in mirrored parallel dimensions that are again at the same time so in a genius way structured in this say package of a film that is, I think, so accessible, and yet at the same time gives us a world that just expands beyond our wildest imaginations in terms of the realm of cinema. This is a film that is truly, truly breathtaking. It is a truly breathtaking work, and it shows and it doesn't show, and it reveals and it doesn't reveal. And in that act of revelation and non-revelation, it, in this extraordinary, paradoxical way, reveals all and nothing, all at once. And that is, I think, perhaps at the very heart of how I see the beauty of this film, In the Mood for Love. So it has a simplicity, and it also has this complexity, and it's that tension, and it's that conflict that creates one of the greatest works of art of the modern era of cinema. This is the work from Wong Kar Wai, and it is花样年華, or in English, In the Mood for Love. The Criterion Collection has released this set, World of Wong Kar Wai, with the new 4K digital restorations of the films. And with this film, In the Mood for Love, we have, or the materials describe it as being under the aspect ratio of 1.66 to 1 with this new restoration. And I should say also, just for the sense of rounding out the discussion of the production details, so this is also a film whose cinematography is credited to Christopher Doyle and Mark Lee Pingbing, and also the production designer, editor, and costume designer is William Cheng Suk Ping. And so this is, of course, very important in terms of the details. And the music is also very important, too, and I will get to that in more detail when discussing the supplements. But first we have this presentation, and I will get to the presentation, this new 4K restoration, my comments on the presentation in the later part of this particular video. But before I do, let me first talk about the supplements that can be found that accompany the disc which houses the film In the Mood for Love. So the Blu-ray here, In the Mood for Love, has a number of supplements which, for the most part, are mirroring the earlier individual release that was made by the Criterion Collection at spine number 147. This is the earlier individual release Blu-ray of that, and then even earlier it was released on a 2-disc DVD set. And so the new release of this film by Criterion has, for the most part, almost the same package of supplements that we found on the earlier Blu-ray. There are some differences, and there are indeed other differences as well with the DVD release, and I'll get to that momentarily. But first, what do we have on this new box set Blu-ray release of In the Mood for Love? So first we have the documentary, which is described as being from 2001, which is At In the Mood for Love. And this is approximately 51 minutes. And this is the documentary that is essentially assembled or put together by Wong Kar Wai. And this is a really in-depth, intimate look in the making or in the production process of this film. And I think the production process is one of the great stories of this film itself, because it is an incredibly complicated production history, and you get a sense of the complex nature of the production history when you watch this particular documentary from Wong Kar Wai, and how it was one film but it became something else, or it developed into many different things over time. And we had the amount of time that it took in order to reach the final product that was In the Mood for Love. And we have also comments from Maggie Jung and Tony Leung, and about how there wasn't necessarily a concrete script to begin with, but how Wong Kar Wai and his way of working is essentially operating on a sense of a feeling or an idea, and also how the film started out being something, but it ended up perhaps transforming into something else. In this context, too, we have to remember, or we have to recall, the possible connections that this film, In the Mood for Love, has with an earlier work by Wong Kar Wai, which is called Days of Being Wild. And so there is, or there could be, a type of maybe is it a sequel? Is it a more distant spiritual connection, or is the connection perhaps Well, it depends on how you view the two films, of course, but there is the possibility of a type of connection between these two works, and that is alluded to in the supplements, for example, in this particular documentary. And also we get a sense of what the story, therefore, of In the Mood for Love might have been in its early stages, and how it might have been perhaps a little bit more, in the words of Tony Leung, I think, in the documentary, it might have been a little bit more, it might have been a little bit naughtier or a little bit more erotic in terms of its direct depictions of the relationships that are the central focus of the particular film, and how that may or may not be consistent, or how that may or may not be what the final film ended up being. And also there is some interesting ways that the documentary is showing the actual production process, rehearsal process. There's an interesting detail or moment where we see Wong Kar Wai without his trademark sunglasses, so he's wearing regular glasses, as it were. So that's an interesting background glimpse into the working process of Wong Kar Wai, and he doesn't always wear those glasses, although for the most part he does wear the sunglasses. And there's a discussion of the dress, the fashion sense, and how this is a very important aspect of the characterizations, in particular the characters, for instance, played by Rebecca Pan and also by Maggie Cheung, of course, and how Maggie Cheung was trying to act in this particular setup, and how it felt very much restraining her, and she wasn't quite used to it. But then there was this moment where she got used to it, and in fact that feeling of restraint was in many ways a perfect embodiment of the balance, or the counterbalance, between passion and restraint that is at the heart of the film and the emotional terrain that it's traversing. And so the way in which fashion becomes, in many ways, the perfect symbol or image or metaphor of what the film is about. Just the way that things are hanging together and connected together in such a beautifully complete way, and the fashion being a great example of that. I think you get a great sense of this in this documentary. And then there's this the way that ideas are expressed and reached towards their final destination. And perhaps what we get in the final film is or is not what the final film may have been or should have been. Who knows? There are so many avenues of mystery and possibility that I think we get a sense of when we watch this documentary. So please check out this documentary if you can. It is just so worth it. Again, it's 51 minutes, so this is and then In the Mood for Love, with the documentary from director Wong Kar Wai. So that's the first supplement that's found here. And then the second supplement is the short film from 2000, and this is花樣年華, and this is approximately 2 minutes. This is also from Wong Kar Wai, and this is based upon, or using, or relying upon the song, the Zhou Xuan song, and this is a very important song that features actually in the film In the Mood for Love. It is also evocative or expressive or suggestive of a particular point in time in history, both in terms of culture and environment. And also it is the opportunity for, in terms of the context of this film, for Wong Kar Wai to explore the history of cinema, also the history of the depiction of women in cinema, and also therefore by means of this a way in which he is in essence exploring the role and look and the existence, if you will, of women in Hong Kong, or in this particular part of the world, in this particular society at the time. And this is, of course, I think, meant to link, for example, to the way in which the film In the Mood for Love is expressing this particular aspect of history and society, the way in which the female characters in this film are being depicted. But it's also meant, I think, to show us the way in which Wong Kar Wai is using cinema, using the nitrate prints of these various scenes or snippets or excerpts or archival footage that is assembled using this particular music as a backdrop, and showing us also the intersection between the significance of the history of cinema as well as the significance of the history of Hong Kong, as well as the way in which this film, In the Mood for Love, is related to all of that, both in terms of image and history and sound. Because as I say, the song Hoa Yang Nianhua is also very important. Zhou Xuan, this is very important, and not just in the context of this short film, but also in the context of In the Mood for Love. So well worth checking out if you can. This is the short film from Wong Kar Wai, approximately 2 minutes. And speaking of music, then the next supplement we have is focusing in on the soundtrack. And this is described as being from 2012, approximately 8 minutes. This is from the great film historian, critic, expert extraordinaire, Mr. Tony Raines. And here he is talking about each of the key songs or pieces of music that appears or that are featured in this film, In the Mood for Love. And he's talking about the way, the eclectic variety that is being employed by Wong Kar Wai. So for example, we have very popular love song ballads of the time, and also songs that are very much reliant or connected with, say, a Chinese opera, which is also very much used or utilized or represented in the film in terms of the expression of past and present, or yet even a further past, and a type of a nostalgia, a type of yearning for something that was in the past but now is existent in the dreams and the fantasies, if you will, of the particular characters, and how songs in fact also transcend or traverse time and place, because songs also in the film serve in interesting ways as a type of point of expression or communication as well. But going back to the Tony Raines discussion, he talks about the significance of the use of music in the world of Wong Kar Wai, and in particular In the Mood for Love. And so he mentions each of the songs. For example, a Rebecca Pan, Chinese opera, Nat King Cole, Zhou Xuan, and Michael Galasso, and also Shigeru Umebayashi. And speaking of Umebayashi, probably one of the most iconic uses of music in this film, In the Mood for Love, is the Umebayashi work, which is the Valse Triste, which is the Yumeji's theme, which is from originally the film by Seijun Suzuki, Yumeji. And so it is employed here in a very dreamlike, or maybe dreamlike is an improper word, perhaps more, it's employed in a very specific way that is very much associated oftentimes with slow motion, the dreamy, static nature of points in time that seem to be both still and also suggestive of a movement forward. And so almost there is an inescapability of the movement or propelling forward of time, even at the points where you want time to stop. And so those points being perhaps the moments of heightened passion and restraint between the two characters, the two main characters. And indeed, in a lot of ways, the song or the music, Yumeji's theme, emerges at these key points. And it emerges quite a number of times, as Tony Raines explains to us or reminds us. And so this is a great example of the discussion from Tony Raines and the importance of music, how it reflects history, how it reflects the emotional conditions of the characters, how it reflects communication and plot points, and also it is very much part of the feeling and life of Wong Kar Wai as an artist and as a human being, and what he is trying to express, as I say, in these autobiographical terms, which are also undeniably part of the film. So all in all, a brilliant, brilliant discussion from the one and only Mr. Tony Raines on the soundtrack. And then to continue on, we have a set of interviews or discussions from Wong Kar Wai himself. So the first is described as being from 2001, and it's an interview with Wong Kar Wai, approximately 22 minutes. And here he is speaking by himself, or he's speaking to the interviewers and talking about many aspects of the film that are it's very important, and he's providing a lot of great context and background, which is, especially for someone like myself who is not a native speaker of the language. I don't know directly. I've never lived in this part of the country, or this part of the world, excuse me, and so I don't have the direct links to, say, cultural aspects of the Shanghai culture as is represented by these characters who were from Shanghai living in Hong Kong in the early 1960s. And so, for example, Wong Kar Wai in this interview talks about how the expressions of Shanghai culture, as shown in, say, the food that is eaten, prepared and eaten by the characters, how it shows various points in time in terms of the food that they would eat is reflective of the season. And so food is representative of not just culture and Shanghai and the way in which Shanghai is part of now this new Hong Kong way of life, but also it's a expression of time and the progress of time. So that's another brilliant way in which we have this symbol, or this representation that is representative of time and space, past and present, everything all at once, which is so brilliant on the part of Wong Kar Wai. Also, he's talking about the characters and how they seem to be sharing something in the sense of their role-playing, and we know that role-playing and storytelling is also part, very significant in terms of the relationship between the Maggie Cheung character and Tony Leung character. And he's also talking about the original plans, probably having the film go into the early 1970s, and how that would have been the possible way in which this film could have further explored the history of this particular part of the world, Hong Kong, from early 1960s to early 1970s. But ultimately, the plan that plan was dropped in favor of having the film go up to 1966, and so we didn't go into the 1970s, although there are some glimpses of that possibility when we get to some other parts of the supplements. And then we have other aspects too. He mentions a little bit about the relationship between him and Christopher Doyle, and also Mark Lee, and how this has a certain look that is perhaps in contrast to earlier films that he made, like Fallen Angels. And he also speaks too about the key significance of the early 1960s, 1962, the start of the progress of the story of the film, if you like, and the differences between Shanghaiese and Cantonese, the spoken language, and how this is very important as well in terms of indicating the cultural mix or blend, both on a macro level and on a micro level, especially as it operates between the characters of Su Li-jun and Chao Mo-wen, the Maggie Cheung character and the Tony Leung character. So that's a detail that, for example, I would never have gotten because, as I say, I don't speak the language, or I don't speak the languages. So this is very helpful in that way. And he's also talking about the inspiration, or the possible inspirations, Liu Li Chen and the writings, which is also mentioned elsewhere in the supplements, and also music and playing music on set and establishing a mood or atmosphere in order to achieve what it was that he wanted to create on that particular day. And so these and other details emerge in this great interview with Wong Kar Wai, which is one of the supplements here. But that's not all, because we have another supplement within the subset, which is described as a cinema lesson. Again, this is also from 2001. It's described as being from Cannes, and it's approximately 15 minutes. And here we have Wong Kar Wai with moderator, and also in front of an audience, a sitting audience, as it were. And he's giving a presentation. He's also answering questions, and so in this discussion we have the further exploration or elaboration on some of the comments that he shared earlier in other supplements. For example, how there was no script necessarily, that there was this idea of stories, things that he wanted to tell, but he didn't quite know exactly what the direction, the final destination would be. And he's talking about wanting to find a rhythm and in the shooting and the making of the film, and how this how he was talking about how it's important for him to fall in love with the film, and how the Cannes Film Festival schedule, of course, affected how he was trying to make this film, and how it gave him a sense of a deadline on the one hand, but it's not quite clear if what ended up being played at Cannes Film Festival, whether it was it was the final product. Well, let me put it this way. How he describes it in this particular cinema lesson is that it was so up to the wire in terms of trying to reach the deadline that he describes as they weren't able to see the finished film until it was shown at Cannes. And so that's a very interesting concept, because it meant, or it suggests how they were making the film, or the process by which Wong Kar Wai is trying to put together this particular work, and editing it and refining it and rediscovering it. And this is shown in the earlier documentary. It's also shown in these comments here, which is really great, really, really great. I should say too that he does mention like unseen footage or versions or of scenes that were ultimately not used. And I neglected to mention, or I forgot to mention in the discussion of the documentaries, at the At Mark In the Mood for Love documentary. What's key about that documentary too is that it also shows some footage or some versions that ended up not being the final version of the film. And so we get alternate aspects or alternate scenes between the characters, and that gives us a sense of what the film could have been. But it turned out to be something, of course, somewhat different. And this is alluded to in the cinema lesson about the rough cut or unseen footage. And so this is, again, it's good to hear about it here, because it reminds us, again, about how we can see it to a certain extent anyway in that earlier documentary. He's also talking about making films in, say, a Hollywood setting versus Hong Kong, the differences between the two methods or approaches to making films. And also he gives a little bit of comment about the film 2046, and talking about 50 years from 1997, and how that number 2046 is in fact also very much key to the film In the Mood for Love. And also talking about the language and the languages that are used, Shanghaise and Cantonese, and how this is related to his life as a young boy as they moved to Hong Kong, his family moved to Hong Kong, etc. So this is a very rich and lovely conversation from Wong Kar Wai, and so please check it out if you can. Again, approximately 15 minutes. And then that's not all, because then we get a panel discussion between moderator and also Tony Leung and Maggie Cheung at the Toronto International Film Festival. There's a 2000 press conference, approximately 39 minutes. And this is great too, because here we have Maggie Cheung and Tony Leung essentially also fielding questions from the press audience and explaining a little bit about the film. It's moderators Robert Gray. I think at one point early on, he describes the character as being Mrs. Chow. He describes it Mrs. Chow, and you could see Tony Leung and Maggie Cheung looking at each other. Mrs. Chow, who's Mrs. Chow? I think, and then you see Maggie Cheung very politely just whispering to Tony, "Oh, I think he means Mrs. Chan and Mr. Chow." And so but they were very polite about it, and so that was an interesting little detail. But in any event, they do talk about the film. They talk about the possible source inspirations, the locations. It's interesting, especially to hear, for example, Maggie Cheung and how she felt frustrated. She expressed it herself, how she felt frustrated with some aspects of the movie making experience making this film. She does mention how she had made films. She was working with Wong Kar Wai earlier, but this was some time since, and she came back to work with Wong Kar Wai, and so there was a certain sense of frustration in terms of the length of time that was needed to make the film, and her feelings of discomfort with the clothing, the dress, and getting the look and feel down of the period, etc. But there was a certain moment too that she describes where she just transformed, or she got used to it, and she became the character, and that she is so proud of being part of something that has this everlasting legacy. And so I love that very frank discussion, that openness that she has, but also it's not wholly negative, because she's being very honest, but also she is very clear too about her admiration and a devotion and love towards the act of making this great work of art that she is undoubtedly a part of, a very important part of. And also the discussion with Tony Leung as well is great. It's talking about the amount of hair gel that he needed, because his hairstyle is coiffed in a way that's very much reminiscent or expressive of the time, and the idea of tension and sexiness versus, or the tension between sexiness and restraint, and working between the actors, Tony Leung and Maggie Cheung, their working relationship. They obviously have this great mutual respect and adoration, and just it's wonderful to see them together here in the setting of the press conference, because you see them here and they're so friendly and they're so affable. And then you recall their relationship as the characters that they're playing in the film. Wow, what a great parallel that is. And also certain details that are mentioned. The name Su Li Zhen. This is very important, and of course, for those who know the film 2046, and if you know the film Days of Being Wild, you know that there is a very significant aspect to this particular name. It's also, speaking of those film Days of Being Wild, In the Mood for Love and 2046, there's also a connection, of course, between among those films and the Tony Leung character. There may or may not be a connection, we put it that way. And so this and other reasons, again, are reasons why please check out this Toronto International Film Festival press conference if you can. Really amazing stuff. And that's not all, because then we get a section which is called Deleted Scenes, and this has 4 deleted scenes, and it's approximately 8 minutes, 8 minutes, 8 minutes, and 7 minutes respectively. And the first is called Room 2046, 2046. Second is Singapore. Third is the 70s, and fourth is The Secret Reunion. And most of them have an optional audio commentary from Wong Kar Wai himself. So for example, Room 2046, this is of course in reference to a particular place that is a key part of the story of In the Mood for Love. And Wong Kar Wai on the commentary is talking about how this was an old hospital for British soldiers. And this also, he makes comment about Fellini's 8.5, and also he's talking about the significance of the year 1997, etc. So this is so great in terms of seeing this particular deleted scene, as well as hearing the commentary, the optional commentary. And then the next scene, which is Singapore, or it's titled Singapore. This is dealing with a particular component of the film that takes place in this particular part of the world, and dealing specifically with the Tony Leung character. There's the concept of the durian, and how this is, according to Wong Kar Wai, connection to Liu Li Cheng, and this gives rise to a brief discussion about the story, intersection, etc. So again, another great glimpse, another great commentary from Wong Kar Wai. And then the third scene is called the 70s, and here we have the early 1970s, what could have been. As we recall the film, there's one point where it might have been extended into the 70s, but that of course didn't happen. But we do have this glimpse into what the look and design and atmosphere of this particular time period, how it could have been expressed, and the fashion sense and the like. So this is really interesting, again, in terms of what we hear and also what we see. And then the last of these deleted scenes is given the title The Secret Reunion, and this is dealing with the aftermath and a particular way that the story between these two characters might find a certain type of ending or resolution, and you put it that way, in a different part of the world. And this is very, there are similarities, but also there are very big differences in terms of how the film ends. There are similarities, though, too, which is very fascinating. So please check out these deleted scenes maybe after you've seen the film, and it's very fun to exercise to see what similarities and what differences are and the like. So these are the 4 deleted scenes. And then continuing on, we have a music video, which is approximately 4 minutes, which is also described as being directed by Wong Kar Wai. And this is Tony Leung. And this is great, too, because it's almost like Tony Leung as Mr. Chow, as his character, Chow Mo Wan. He's, in a way, he's expressing all this emotion in song and music in a way that perhaps his character in the film might or might not have been able to express it otherwise. So that's an interesting way or reason why, or possible reason why this music video was included. Great stuff. And then we have the restoration trailer that rounds out this particular set of supplements here for this particular Blu-ray included in the set World of Wong Kar Wai.